Hello, this is Carrie Fell. Welcome to my studio. So I think I'm going to try a St. Patrick's Day project. Now, I'm not huge on green, especially St. Patrick's green, but I realized that I have just the right yarn. So I have actually 3 cones of this stuff, and it is a green that I probably wouldn't use by itself. It is a bright green, a cheerful green, but it's just so very green. And I have a good dye project, I think, that will make this green actually beautiful and something that I'll enjoy weaving. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wind off some warps. There's my warping board up there. And I think I'm going to go for a blanket. I have a lot of this yarn, so let's do blankets. In order to know how much yarn to wind off, I'm going to pick a pattern. So I have Davison's Green Book, also appropriate. And I want to do a simple pattern because what I'm going to do is just keep some of this green and over dye it in a dark, probably a black. And so the color will just sort of peek through in areas. I'll use a black weft. And so I want sort of a nice simple pattern to peek through. Don't want it to be too complicated. So we're just going to go for a twill. A twill makes for a nice thick cloth and a blanket. And I think I'm going to go for the goose eye herringbone twill. I'm going to use a resist technique so that we will keep some of that green, but most of the yarn will be a darker color. So let me just show you what I've prepared. So I have a number of cones of this green, and 2 of them were the same dye lot. It looked like they weren't quite 2 full cones, so I just used everything up. And I wound off 6-yard warp chains and just used up the 2 cones. 600-ish ends here. And so that will make not a wide blanket, but a nice cozy hanging out on the couch while watching Netflix blanket. I tightly bound each of the warp chains with a reusable zip tie, and they're all tied in different places so that there'll be random spots that will stay green. So whatever is tied tightly under there is going to stay green, and the rest I'm going to over dye with black. 1, 2, 3, 4 chains and another 5 chains. I only have this 1 pan. I could do it in 2 batches, or I could do it in some in here and some in the pan here, the pot I mean. Since I'm not mixing colors or putting a variety of colors in, I'm just using all black. That might work because I don't have to worry about things matching. Let's see if this makes more sense. If I can put 3 in this pot, that fits 3 easily, then I think this will fit the rest. If I'm moving it around a lot. Yep. Okay then, because I don't need a solid even color, they being packed in here will give it slightly more resist, and all the sections will dye slightly differently, and that is okay with me. There'll be bright green showing underneath these bands, and then there'll be sort of a mottled green where the dye may not reach everywhere else sort of consistently. But I think that'll work. So I'm going to soak these in water now and mix up some black dye. Okay, I didn't measure carefully. I just put a good healthy spoonful of the dye powder in my measuring cup and added hot water to dissolve it. It doesn't matter a whole lot to me, the depth of shade, because this is just, as long as there is green showing and dark areas covering it, that's all that matters to me. What I did do was I filled it to 900 milliliters, and I have 9 chains of warp. 6 will go in here and 3 will go in the pot, and so I'll just make sure I put 600 milliliters of this dye stock in this pan and 300 in the pot over there, so that there'll be a similar depth of shade, and whatever that may be, because I just didn't feel like measuring, and it's not important to me in this project. There is 1/3 of the dye in there, and 3 warp chains coming out of the soaking. The water's tinted, so some of the green dye is even coming off. Interesting. So I'll just top that up. There's no acid yet. So 1, 2, 3 chains, and enough water to cover it all. I am going to stir to make sure that the dye gets onto the inside, and I'll start heating it right away, and then I will add some citric acid at some point, but I'd like the dye to move through the fibers first before I do that, so it doesn't strike right away. And now I'll set up the pan. So I'm gonna add half of what's left to the pan. Yeah, that's about half. And I'll add the yarn to that, and then I'll pour the rest of the dye over top. Whoops, I hit the camera. There's 3. And another 3. So I think the key is going to be to keep moving the yarn around so that the dye can penetrate. It'll be an uneven penetration, which is just fine. And I'm going to add the rest of the the dye now over the top. I'm going to heat it. I'm going to start heating. So this is the rest of the color. And I'll rinse that out and add it as well. Now that's a lot of yarn, a lot of color. Don't know if I added too much liquid or not. This is completely different than anything I've done before. I hope I don't splash. I'm wearing one of my favorite shirts. So now it's just a matter of letting these heat up and moving the fiber around, and that's about it. It's been at least 20 minutes or half an hour, and the dyed water is penetrating the yarn nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and add some citric acid now. Don't want to add too much volume because it's pretty high. So first, I'll add a batch to the pot. Stir that in, and I can always add more acid if I find that the dye's not clearing. So I'm going to move that around a little bit. Get the acid everywhere. And that was just 3 tablespoons of citric acid crystals dissolved in 1.5 cups of water. Again, no measuring the amount of acid as a ratio to the water or anything like that. I'm going by feel and what I know has worked in the past. So, not going to be reproducible. The technique is reproducible, but the exact color won't be. And it's okay with me if the color doesn't get as deep as it could. I don't need this warp to be black. Dark green will suffice. The weft is black, so that it would be nice actually if the warp wasn't completely black. Then the twill pattern that I'm planning on will show up better. And I'm going to turn up the heat a bit. Once it's steaming, and gets to a simmer, then I can turn it down a bit again. Okay, after another 20 minutes or so, we're already starting to see the water in this pot start to clear, which is cool. Yeah, so and I mean, this still looks really dark when you look straight in, but you know, the spoon is showing that the water's definitely clearing. And the yarn does not look black. It looks like a very dark green, maybe black in a couple places, but yeah, I like it. I think that's good. The pan here, let's move over to here. This pan's being a little slower. As you can see, it's not clearing as quickly. It's probably jammed in there a little tighter. The yarn's jammed in there a little tighter, so the dye is having trouble reaching all parts, and also a larger surface area, so I'm guessing it's not as hot yet. It is lighter than it was last time I checked, so it is starting to work. What I have to be careful about is splashing. I'm finding I'm sloshing water and splattering it. So, but as I've mentioned before, this is a dedicated dye kitchen. I do not cook food on this stove or anywhere in this kitchen. This is for dyes only. I'm fortunate enough to have a separate studio with a kitchen, so I can do this. The pots, pans, utensils, everything is only for dyes and will not be used for food. So yeah, I can tell that it's clear, starting to clear already, so this is good. This black this is the first time using the black dyes, and I see it has very much a purple hue to it. Okay, it's another 10 minutes. I have turned down the heat, even though you hear it boiling. Yep, the pot is pretty much clear, and so is the pan. Doing really well. We can see the bottom over here. There's still a dark tinge to the water, and that's fine. And this does look like a dark green. Look at that. Now I'm pulling it out of the water. We can see it, and it's starting to lighten up a bit, but that's a nice green. I like that much better than what we had before. So yes, this is not going to be a black warp, which is good. Oh yeah, I'm liking this. The color is in the yarn, so that extra bit of heat did the trick. It looks like the acid was enough. And I definitely see variation in the color. This part is looking a lot darker than the other part I pulled out and looked at. So I think there'll be some subtleties in the depth of shade. So I'm going to put this on low and let it steam for another 10 minutes. And then I'm going to turn it off and let it cool down in the pot and the pan. So this is cool now. And it looks like just a big dark mess. Well, let's take a look. So I'll take out one of these. This is evening, so we have the light only from the ring light. So what we've got here, we have a deep, deep green. Let's take another one over. Some of these zip ties release better than others. So I want to get one of the ones that releases easily. There, this one. Ah, this one doesn't have as much dark area as some of the others, but it's a beautiful deep green. Yep, with some darker areas there. So let's go rinse these out and we'll remove some zip ties while we're at it. I'm just gonna rinse some of this because the citric acid is bothering my rough hands. So let's remove some zip ties and see what it looks like. Ooh, quite a defined stripe. Just a touch of St. Patty's green. And oh, look at that. The hole in the zip tie creates quite a defined mark. So I'm a little surprised. I actually thought that it would be bright green and then it would sort of be faded out from there. I didn't think there'd be such a defined line. I don't mind it. I like it. I hope it's a big enough area that we'll be able to see a little bit of pattern there. Looks good, no bleeding. We had a little bit of bleeding of the green even before we started dyeing, just in the soaking, so that was kind of interesting. That the green was coming out of the yarn a bit, but it seems to be pretty good now. So I'm going to take off the zip ties and wash and rinse the other 7 skeins, or the other 7 warp chains, and hang them to dry, and we will take another look at them then. So here are the warp chains, or warp bunches anyways, all dried. And there is a great variation in color. This is not purple, even if the camera is making it look like that. So we have the awesome bands where the zip ties were. and that got left the original color of the green. And then everywhere else has various shades of darkness. So some of it got quite black looking, and it's a very deep color, and some of it not so much. It just went green, a darker green than what it was before, and that is just fine with me. I don't mind the variation. It happened because I had so much yarn packed in the pan together, but I kind of knew that was going to happen, and I embraced it and went for it. It makes it much more interesting. So now what I'm going to do is rearrange these boats so that the bright green bands are looking random, and then I'll use that order to put them on the loom. And the warp is on the loom. Kind of interesting. You can see the sections that are dyed slightly differently. Whoa, weird reflections. Okay, you can see the sections and how they're dyed differently, and then you have these green wavy bars going across them where I had the resist on the warp chains. Now up here you'll see how I work, and it's a little unorthodox. I kind of wing things and deal with things as they happen. So I spread the warp with a scrap yarn. This is lashed on first here, and then I spread the warp with this yarn here, this red. And what I found was that my metal bar was a little narrower. I didn't slide this bar here down far enough, so it's actually a slight bit narrower than my warp. What I did was I lashed on anyways. I used a temple to spread the weaving when I did this, and then I wound it around the bar, the breast beam, and because there was some give, it was sort of in here. The trusty green tape actually works. So I pulled it apart, and this gives me the spread that I need to weave the actual blanket. Of course, I'll take it off, and once this comes around the beam and around, I don't think I'll need tape. But anyway, yeah, easier than a temple actually. And this is the other way, other thing I do is I get it on there when I'm doing a twill. Sometimes a twill will work out just as is, and sometimes we have trouble with selvages where it won't catch. And you know, I try to do without floating selvages as much as possible. So what I did is I just started weaving, and I started weaving just the regular straight draw to give me this wavy twill. And I found that the outermost thread was not catching, and the outermost thread on both sides were not catching. So rather than install a floating selvage, this is what I did. I just cut it. I just cut that outermost thread off. It's just gonna hang. It's also cut on this side, and it's just hanging back there. I do not need it. And for the second blanket, I'll probably use a different pattern than this one, and I may grab those outermost threads and use them as floating selvages if I need them. But yeah, so now my selvages are catching as long as I just keep doing the same treadling, which is what I'm going to do while I get used to weaving on a wide warp again. I might change it up a little bit for the next one. So I have woven about 2 feet, about 24 inches, and it's going really well actually. You can see here where it's starting to wind around the cloth beam. I like to use a piece of cardboard just at the very beginning. It covers up my knots and keeps everything smooth on the front beam. Just the one piece of cardboard, and then it starts to wind up on itself, and that's fine. The side over here where the tie-on bar was not as wide as it should have been has all resolved. My tape temple kept it wide. Once it got over to the beam, I taped it to the cardboard and to the beam, sort of pulling it wide enough, and that kept the tension up. And there we go. I'm weaving without a temple. It's not needing one, which is great. This little bit here is how I measure. I measured from the beginning up to my fell line and put a marker in there, and then I write down on my notes that I have hanging right here, hanging with a pencil taped to it. And so that's at the 19-inch mark. And once that's moved down towards the beam, I'll measure from this marker to a new one, and then write down the length on my clipboard. This is actually the widest piece I have woven on this loom. It's an old wreck of a loom. It looks like it was used in a community center, and maybe for teaching purposes. It didn't belong to a single person, so it's been beat on over the years and has some quirks. So being the first time for me to go this wide, I've had the loom for a number of years, but I've always woven narrower for some reason. Because I'm doing such a wide piece, I'm doing a nice simple twill, and I hope the dyeing process is giving it a little bit of interest. Now the weft is actually a different yarn than the warp. It's a little thicker, and the way I'm making it work with this is I'm making sure that the set is fairly close. It's 15. I'm just going to show you. There's where the marking is on the reed that shows you that this is a 10 dent reed. I've got it slayed 1 2 1 2, so 15 ends in an inch. And so that's a fairly tight set for this type of yarn. And one reason is to stop the black weft from beating down and covering my dyed warp. So it seems like it's turning out just right, because I can give it a good firm beat, but it's not beating down hard. And one reason that it's not beating down hard is I did the last 6 selvage threads in the weft yarn. So that's a very tight slaying for that type of yarn. So when I beat on it, it won't beat down any further. And so that sort of protects the beater from shoving everything down too far by making a nice thick selvage, and that's on both sides. And it won't even be noticeable as a thicker selvage, because it's a subtle thing. Just finished weaving the second blanket. So there's 2 blankets wrapped around here. Oh, that's kind of a cool angle. And this one has a slightly different treadling. I've hem stitched across the edges, and I still have a fair amount of warp left, actually. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm still going to cut it off. I'm not going to weave anymore. I'm going to cut it off and leave the warp on, preserve the threading, and tie on a new warp. And I'm thinking maybe of using that warp there. It's not enough width for blankets, so I'll add something else into it. I don't know what, but I've had the warp here for a long time. I no longer want to do the draft that's I assigned to it. So I'll throw in some other wool with it and we'll turn it into blankets. So I'll cut it about 1 inch from the beam. That's about 8 inches long, which is a good length to work with when I'm doing fringe. First cut, I'm going to tie a loop here just so that the warp doesn't pull back through the reed and all the heddles. We want to keep that threading. Another one at this end. And I think I'll separate them here as well, just because I have a warp beam, which gives me a nice straight line on which to cut. So how long is that? 13 inches, so 6.5. So I'm cutting right along the warp beam here. One blanket, I can already feel that this has got some nice weight and warmth to it, even though it hasn't been wet finished yet. Ah, right, it's taped. Taped to the beam. The blanket's been washed, and there's a couple more things I need to do before it's finished. So I need to trim these ends. They were twisted and then knotted, and so I'm going to go along and cut the ends just below the knot so that all this mess is gone, and that's on both sets. And then I'm going to give it a press. As you can see, it's a little bit wrinkly, but after a good steam press, it will be done. And here is the second radar blanket. It started off being a St. Patrick's Day blanket, and when I realized it was not going to be able to be done, or the video released in March, this is now July, they became radar blankets. When Darius, my son, took one look at it and decided that the green blips looked like radar blips. I think this turned out really cool. I love how each of the warp chains are subtly discernible in lengthwise stripes, and the dye took differently in different parts of the warp chains. So we have dark greens, and then we have the resist bands. This second blanket had a sort of a rose path treadling. The first one was just a 12, so it looked like V's down the length. I can't show it. It is off at the store. We'll see it. I'll see if I can post a photo of what it looked like before I sent it off. It's fairly thick and it folds nicely in its hot bath and finishing. So yes, I'm really happy with it. I love how the little rose path patterns come and go. In some areas you can hardly see it at all, where the black dye is the heaviest. A big thank you to all my patrons who support me as I create these videos. If you'd like to become a patron yourself, the link is in the description below. Thank you for watching!